This slideshow will focus on the founding and beginning of each of the 13 colonies. At first, as the explorers were coming in and finding North America and looking for things like the Northwest Passage, there wasn't a lot of colonization. But what happened in England caused a lot of people wanting to leave and find a new place to live, which caused the colonies in North America. And this was really big religious, economic, and political changes. So that's what you're looking for your first set of notes: religious, economic, and political changes. And they encouraged people to leave and found the colonies. And one of those things was the religious part, and that is the Anglican Church. Okay, and so what happened is the Anglican Church was a brand new church that was created by this man, King Henry VIII. Before that, England was mostly a Catholic country run by the Pope, right, and the Catholic Church. And so what ended up happening is Henry VIII was having a hard time having an heir, a boy, with his wife, Catherine of Aragon. And what ended up happening is he asked for a divorce so that he could find someone who could give him a son, right? And so the Pope said, no, divorce is not okay in the Catholic Church, and said you can't do that. And so Henry said, you know what, fine, I will make my own church. We're breaking off from the Catholic Church. We are going to make the Anglican Church, and I am the leader of it. And so the King of England became the leader of this church. Now, this church still had a lot of the same things as Catholicism, a lot of Catholic qualities. And so a new group of people called the Puritans came in, and those people were a group that wanted to take all of the Catholic elements out. So they wanted to purify the church of the Catholic elements, and they also didn't want the king being in charge of their leaders. They wanted to elect their own leaders. But the king at that time, King James, said, we're not going to make any changes to this church. And so a lot of people said, okay, fine, then we're out of the country. We'll leave England. And a lot of them went to North America so that they could fully be Puritans there. Another thing that happened is economic changes. So as England is, the population's really starting to get bigger, and people need land, and people need jobs, and they need all of these things. And at about this time in history, joint stock companies were developed. A joint stock company is a business in which many investors put together their money to fund large projects. So, whereas it'd be really hard for one person to be able to afford an entire colony, right? You don't have that kind of money to set up a whole colony. If a whole bunch of investors put money together, then they could all work or all put that money in, and then whatever profits got split between them all. So now people could afford huge ventures like going out and starting a colony. But colonizing was not easy. Don't let anybody tell you that it was easy. One of the first colonies, Roanoke, they were set up are on an island right off of the coast of North Carolina. And in the first winter, it was so difficult, the settlers actually came back to England. And then the second group went in, and they went back because they hadn't heard anything from them, and they had all disappeared mysteriously. And so it was really kind of a weird situation. We're not even sure what happened to the people of Roanoke. The first permanent colonies started out in the Chesapeake, and so the very first colony that is still around today was Jamestown. Jamestown, the Virginia Company, was given permission to start a colony in 1606. So this joint stock company, the king said, you can start this colony, and so they went with a bunch of men in ships. And about 144 men in 3 ships sailed off to Virginia in 1606, and then they arrived. And about 104 that had survived the passage started to create this settlement. Now, the winters were really, really hard at this time because they didn't have the food set up. They didn't have everything that they needed. And so the only way that they were actually able to survive is to trade a lot of their goods and tools and things like that to the Powhatan people, the Native Americans, to have food to survive the winter. By 1610, however, by the end of that really, really bad winter, only about 60 of the settlers remained alive. And what happened at that point is supplies finally arrived from across from England. About 3 English ships came across with them. They also had 150 more settlers to help out with the work, and a new governor who convinced them to stay. All right, so that got better, but they really needed to find a way to make some money as they were going through. And so the way that they did that was they figured out a cash crop that would work really well in the Virginia area, in the Jamestown area. Now, a cash crop is a crop that is planted only to make money. You cannot consume it. It's not something you can do. It is just so that you can sell it and make some money off of it. All right. And so tobacco took off and a whole lot of money started to flow through the Virginia Company. The Virginia Company in 1618 allowed Jamestown to make its own lawmaking body called the House of Burgesses. And then in 1619, the first kind of slaves were brought in. These were 20 African people were purchased and brought in as slaves. They called them Christian servants and not slaves at this time, but soon thereafter, slaves would be being shipped into America. These were just the first ones that we know of. And then by about 1622, a whole bunch of settlers came in. 4,500 settlers came in, and they were there. And the Powhatan thought, "Holy cow! Look at all these people! They're coming in. They're going to take our land." So the Powhatan people attacked them. Okay, and more than 300 settlers were killed during this attack. And an English court said, you know whose fault it was? It was the Virginia Company because they were not prepared to protect their people. And so they took away their charter, and Virginia and Jamestown became a royal colony where the king was in charge of it instead of this Virginia Company. All right, the second one we're going to talk about is Maryland, the second colony. Maryland was developed by a man named George Calvert who wanted to develop a colony because his people, the Catholic people, were being persecuted in England. And so he wanted to set up a colony where the Catholics could get away to. And so he ended up dying, but his son was given a large piece of land and told that he was able to have a proprietary colony there, which is kind of an interesting thing. A proprietary colony says the owner can do anything that they want in that area at all, as long as it isn't against English law. So as long as they're not breaking the law, they can do anything they want. And so Maryland found out, though, that even though they were set up as a Catholic refuge, a lot of the people that were living there were Protestants. So they quickly decided to take on the Toleration Act of 1649 and say, you know what, all Christians, we tolerate all Christians, so that they could not have conflict within their own colony. All right, now we'll talk about the Puritan colonies. In England, this group of Puritans that were called the Separatists said, you know what, the Anglican Church is too corrupt to be reformed, and they left. And a lot of them went to the Netherlands. They were called the Pilgrims. And then they came back, hooked up with another group of people, got on the Mayflower ship, and left for America. They were going to Virginia to try and make a colony there. They were way off track. They missed Virginia by a lot, and they ended up arriving in Plymouth, Massachusetts on September 16th, 1620. Before they even got off the boat, 41 of the 102 colonists came in and signed the Mayflower Pact, basically saying, we will do whatever and work together to make sure that this colony is successful, and we'll hold each other accountable. And so they got off the ship. They built a common house where they could all kind of live together at first and do their government things, and then they started to build small individual homes for each. Now, as they were rolling into that first winter, again, very, very dangerous. Things could be bad. But I think that the surviving Pilgrims probably would have died if it wasn't for the help of Squanto, who was a Wampanoag man, or Wampanoag, sorry, I said that wrong, who was a Wampanoag man, and he taught them how to grow corn and showed them where to fish and all of those things. And so the next year, when the harvest came in, they had a big celebration that we now has developed into the celebration of Thanksgiving, where the natives and the Pilgrims came together and had a meal. The other colony that was happening up there was the Massachusetts Bay Colony. John Winthrop was a really rich man, but he was a Puritan back in England, and his company, called the Massachusetts Bay Company, had gotten a charter to start a colony. But when he noticed that the Puritans were really getting persecuted and talked down on and having all kinds of issues in England, and so what he did is he decided he would open up the Massachusetts Bay Colony to be just like a home for the Puritans. And so yeah, he created this colony, and it exploded through this great migration. So tons and tons of people came in, and by the year 1643, there were 20,000 settlers who had arrived in New England and had come over. Right, their government was set up, and a couple of the main tenets of the Massachusetts Bay Colony was that church and state were separate, so they couldn't, the government and the church could not, interfere with each other, and they were absolutely not going to tolerate any other religious ideas other than the Puritan ideas. Take a minute to write out the answer to this question. All right, because of Massachusetts' religious intoleration, this man named Roger Williams in 1631, he showed up in Massachusetts with whole different views than everybody else. He thought that the Puritans had corrupted themselves by staying with the Anglican Church, basically saying if you really believe they're that bad, then you should have broken off and done something else. He also believed that the king had no rights to give away land that belonged to the natives, and so it was pretty native friendly. People really were frustrated by these views, and he ended up getting banished and deported back to England. They said, you cannot stay here. He did escape with a few followers, and he went down and eventually established a town in Rhode Island called Providence. And then what he set up there was that the government would have no authority at all over religion, and then he had bought some land. The way that he got this land is he bought it from the Native Americans, and so he set up the town of Providence, and then Portsmouth town was established by another person who got banished, Anne Hutchinson. She talked bad about a couple of ministers in the Puritan church and was banished and kicked out of Massachusetts and went there and started a new town. And then other people were kicked out, banished from Massachusetts, and they created Newport and Warwick, and eventually all of these banished people banded together to create Rhode Island and Providence Plantations Colonies. So what we know now is Rhode Island, and kind of their main idea was that they should have religious freedom and that the government should not be in charge of religion. The area started to expand and people took over more land, and in 1636 Thomas Hooker was given a charter in the Connecticut River Valley, and he went over there and started a brand new colony under which he created a constitution called the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. And over this constitution, one of the main tenets was that all adult men should be able to vote for their leaders, vote for the laws, vote for everything. And so the other thing that happened is a lot of the north of Massachusetts area started to get broken up too, and one charter was given to New Hampshire. They became their own colony in 1679, and then Maine was another charter that was given, but Maine was given to become part of Massachusetts, and so that land stayed as part of Massachusetts for a very long time. Soon after, a war broke out. This was called King Philip's War. In the 1670s, the colonies' governments demanded that the natives follow their laws. The natives didn't want to. They didn't think that the colonials were in charge of them at all. And so Plymouth Colony took 3 of the men from this native tribe, the Wampanoag, and tried them and executed them for murdering someone. And so now this made the natives very upset, and so the war started. This war was named after the native leader, Metacomet, which the colonists called King Philip. And so during this war, the colonists had killed Metacomet, and they mounted his head on a stick and paraded it through their settlements, showing off. Okay. By the time the war ended, 1678, there were very few natives at all left in all of New England. This was kind of the end of the natives in that area. Soon another round of colonization started, and it started just after the English Civil War had ended. The English Civil War happened in 1642, and it was kind of the Puritan Parliament versus King Charles I. And so what ended up happening is the king sent troops out against the Puritan leaders who had kind of been taking over the government. The Parliament created their own army, and they ended up fighting against each other. The Parliament's troops ended up capturing the king and cutting his head off in 1649. The leader of the Parliament, Oliver Cromwell, took over and ruled as pretty much a dictator till he died in 1658. Then his son tried to take over and was unable to do it. So the Parliament invited Charles II, King Charles I's son, to take back over the throne. When the monarchy was back and restored and things were back to normal, that opened up for more colonization in the Americas. And so New York was first. New Netherlands had been this, remember, it belongs to the Netherlands. It had been this big, growing, and diverse area, and had become just a really great place. And so Charles II ended up taking it from the Dutch, and he gave it to the Duke of York, to one of his people, and it became known as New York in 1664. Then New Jersey was also given to the Duke of York at this time, and he gave it to others. But it brought in a lot of people to New Jersey because they said, if you come and live here in New Jersey, we'll give you land grants, which means we're going to give you land. We're going to make sure there's religious freedom happening, and you'll have your own legislative assembly so you can make your own laws. And here's the last few colonies we're going to talk about. First, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn, who was a Quaker. And Quakers were kind of interesting people. They believed in pacifism, peace, and no war, nothing like that. They believed in religious freedom. Anybody should be able to do what they want. And really, there's no need for these religious leaders. You don't need it. Okay. And so what ended up happening is William Penn, his father, Charles II, the king, owed him a lot of money. And so to settle up his debt, he gave William Penn a big piece of land that we know as Pennsylvania today. And William Penn decided to create a colony, a Quaker colony. He made it a center of political and religious freedom. Anyone could come as long as they were tolerant of other people. It grew so fast that he had to buy 3 more colonies south of Pennsylvania to fit all the people in, and that would later become Delaware in 1682. King Charles was also interested in the area between Virginia and Spanish Florida, because down here is Spanish Florida. Okay, so he was interested in this area, and so he developed that into the Carolinas in 1663. Carolina is Latin for Charles. Okay, so named after him. It wasn't separate at first. It was just called the Carolinas, but it did develop into 2 very different colonies with 2 very different kind of cultures. The North was all about farming. North Carolina was all about farming and growing tobacco, whereas the South, they tried to grow sugarcane, but it just didn't grow well there. And so the people in the South started to trade deer skins from the natives back home, and they were also making money and being kind of the center of the slave trade in America. Then the last colony of the 13, the original 13, was Georgia. That happened in 1733. James Oglethorpe looked around in the prisons of England and saw that there were so many people who were there just because they owed money. So just because they were poor, they were in prison owing other people money. And he asked for if he could take these debtors, people that wanted to be in there, and take them to America and start a new colony in Georgia. Okay, and so that ended up happening, and by 1775, and so him and 19 other trustees kind of found this area and named the colony after King George, the guy who had given him that land, that charter. Okay, and the settlers arrived in 1733, and by 1752, Georgia had become a royal colony owned by the government. finish off the slideshow with your questions.